Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. In today's discussion show, we'll be looking at one of the big controversies of the day, and it goes by the name of democracy promotion. The expression sounds simple, even laudable, but the reality on the ground can be very different. The United States and Egypt are in the middle of a spat over Cairo's crackdown on pro-democracy groups. The immediate row may be over, but the Egyptian authorities charge 43 people of receiving illegal foreign funding. They included staff of the National Democratic Institute and the International Republican Institute, both of which receive funding from the US government. It's not the first time this has happened. A comparable row took place ahead of Russia's disputed parliamentary vote in December last year. Russian officials clamped down on Golosh, an election watchdog that receives millions of dollars of funding from the US aid budget. So, are these organizations really non-governmental, as the acronym NGO would suggest? Are they independent, liberal, and working for the betterment of mankind, or the acceptable face of New Age Western imperialism? And how would Americans like it if Egypt, Russia, or China were funding political groups in their backyard? To probe these questions, we're hosting a debate in our London studios. I'm joined by Peter Willets, a professor from London City University, Dr. Armine Ishkanian from the London School of Economics, Max Wind-Cowie from the think tank Demos, and on the line from Moscow, Dmitri Babbitch, our in-house political analyst. Max, perhaps you can start us off and give us a background introduction to the NGO situation between Washington and Cairo.
Well, what we've seen in Egypt is remnants of the Mubarak regime and the clique that has been running Egypt for a considerable amount of time, who've remained in authority after the protests that formed part of the Arab Spring, and who have decided to crack down on those groups within Egyptian society who are advocating for the kind of the hopes of the Arab Spring and the hopes of the Egyptian revolution to be fulfilled and for proper and full democracy to come about. And what the example that you gave of the 43 who were arrested in Cairo highlights is a real difficulty that regimes like that in Egypt have with understanding how an organisation can be non-governmental when it receives governmental funding from countries like ours in the UK or from the US. And I would argue that that misunderstanding comes from a genuine misapprehension about what it is that democracies do when they fund NGOs working in places like Egypt or indeed in places like Russia to promote democracy. We see that as being a neutral value that we're promoting. We hear what be it Putin or be it the regime in Egypt say about, at least in name, signing up to the principles of democracy. And so we feel safe to be sponsoring organisations that are working to fight corruption and unfair practices in the practice of democracy. But what authoritarian regimes often see this as being is a non-neutral, direct assault on their authority and their ability to coerce their populations through a series of measures, including elections that are anything but free and fair.
Peter, it's become a really, really big issue now because America has suggested that the $1.3 billion the US gives to Egypt is being questioned now.
Indeed. I'd like to respond to what Max said about NGOs. I think there's a great deal of confusion about the term, and there's a tendency, because of this foreign money being important in countries where civil society is just being formed in a more vigorous and diverse way, to equate NGOs with foreigners. And that is nonsense. It is nonsense even when you have in Egypt or we have in Russia an organisation like Human Rights Watch, which started in the United States and Europe, but has become a global organisation, or Amnesty International or Greenpeace or many other organisations are global but have deep roots, or sometimes in newly emerging democracies, rather more shallow roots in every society. So an NGO is not foreign because it is international. And indeed, the concept of NGOs must cover both domestic NGOs and international NGOs, and even local community NGOs. And the fashion is in Africa, for example, say NGOs are all foreign, but they have civil society organizations. To me, those are simply local NGOs.
Just to agree with something that Peter just said, I mean, it's certainly become very fashionable to decry things like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International as being products of Western funding and products of Western society. But to accuse them of being in collusion with Western governments simply because they may receive aspects or portions of funding from them is ludicrous. If you look at the work of Human Rights Watch, if you look at the work of Amnesty International, they dedicate huge amounts of time in terms of their country offices here and in the US to criticising our governments in a way that they probably actually wouldn't be quite brave enough to do while in Cairo or in Moscow.
Well, and of course, Amnesty in Moscow is forbidden to criticise Moscow
indeed.
under the own country rule, that they can't work on the politics of their own country.
There's also an issue of funding, because for many human rights NGOs around the world, including places like Ethiopia, most of their funding is coming from foreigners or foreign organizations, because locally it's not so popular to fund, let's say, certain human rights issues.
But just because there isn't the resource. I mean, it's not just because they don't care about human rights, they don't have the money to give away.
But it's not simply, it's a way to delegitimize the work that human rights NGOs do by claiming that you're getting funding from another organization based in another country, and therefore you are not concerned about the issues in this country, or you're not loyal, quote unquote. I think part of this, in Russia at least, goes back, this concern with NGOs goes back to 2005, 2006, particularly in response to what had happened earlier in Ukraine with the Orange Revolution, and earlier than that in Georgia with the Rose Revolution. These color revolutions, I would argue, led to a backlash, not just in Russia, but in many other countries, against NGOs and also against democracy promotion. It was seen as somehow being a way to not only buy the hearts and minds of people, but also to, as a form, as you said, of soft imperialism by the US.
Now, Dmitri, I want you to have a chance to get in here. We've moved on to Russia, but I just want to take us back to Egypt a little bit and let you have your say on that one.
Well, my opinion may sound strange to most of the participants who seem to agree with each other on a few basic points. But my point of view is just to compare it. In the 20s, when the Soviet Union sponsored communist organizations abroad, and indeed the Soviet embassies helped to promote communist revolutions in other countries, it was exactly what the foreign NGOs are now doing in countries like Egypt and Russia.
These no.
Hang on. Let Dmitri have his say.
Yes, these organizations, I don't want to say that they get direct orders or that they are part of the US government or English government. There is a certain ideology which believes, it views humans only as voters, as consumers, inside the market economy, and as parties to court. And in Egypt, what happened was that there was this revolution that removed the old authoritarian regime. Parts of it regime remained, and the alternative is actually Islamists coming to power, because suddenly this Western ideology that once you have free elections, everything will be settled, that ideology didn't work in Egypt. It didn't work in Gaza, where Hamas won. It didn't work in lots of other places, just because this ideology works for the West, but it doesn't work for a number of other countries.
Dmitri,
we should not forget about Egypt. I'll just finish. We should not forget that a huge part of the population there is illiterate. So foreign NGOs who fight for legal rights, who fight for voting rights, they just forget that in the West, before people started to vote, they at least learned to read and write. That's not the case in places like Egypt or even Tunisia.
Dimitri, I think you'll find that certainly in the case of Egypt, the West does an awful lot more to help people to learn to read and write than perhaps Russian foreign policy does. I would ask you a question, though. You were talking about how democracy promotion is somehow antithetical to certain regimes and certain cultures. Would you say that was the case in terms of Russia? I mean, so is promoting democracy in Russia somehow opposed to future President Putin's, to his philosophy of government? Or is it actually something which he, at least he seems to say that he does, supports and therefore should be perfectly comfortable with?
Well, I can tell you that Russia is a very diverse country. We have certain areas, certain regions, which are very different from regions like Moscow and St. Petersburg, which are basically European. So in Russia, we will never be as democratic as Great Britain, and we will never be as authoritarian as, say, China is now. We're somewhere in between. And there are lots of other ways besides elections and courts to help people preserve their human dignity. In China, there were other means to do it. There were so-called censors who just said that in the old times things were not done this way. In Russia, we had this moral authority of writers such as Pushkin or Tolstoy. So every country has its own historic institutions. And to claim that West European model fits countries like Russia or Egypt or Palestine is just, unfair, and it means denying thousands of years of history.
Do you want to see the world in all of its diversity? Listen to one of the oldest radio stations in the world, the Voice of Russia, and you'll gain a comprehensive understanding of the most important world events.
You're listening to the Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're having a debate on NGOs and democracy promotion. I'm joined by the City University professor Peter Willets, Dr. Armine Ishkanian from the London School of Economics, Max Wind-Cowie from the think tank Demos, and on the line from Moscow by Dmitri Babbitch, our in-house political analyst. Turning to you, Dr. Armine, what we've just heard from Dmitri over there in Moscow is that what we're seeing here is an exportation of a Western European model on other parts of the world, and that this is unfair. Is that how you see it?
I have a slightly different take on it because I believe, first of all, like democracy, there are other things. Just because it was developed in the West doesn't mean it doesn't apply other places. For instance, there's the argument about noodles and gunpowder. Just because it was developed in China, we all seem to use them. So that doesn't matter where it was developed. Do these ideas apply? Do citizens in Russia want to have rule of law, want to have respect of rights, want the courts to be working in a proper order? If the answer is yes, then we can talk about democracy in Russia. And moreover, I would like to say it's not just about NGOs. It's about civil society more broadly. The people out in the streets in Tahrir Square in Egypt weren't just NGOs. They were far from NGOs because the NGOs, by the time they realized what was going on, were too late to catch up. And moreover, the people in Moscow, in the streets of Moscow, aren't simply NGOs. So I think that's what we need to think about and look at and ask questions whether the citizens want better governance, more rule of law, instead of just thinking about elections. I don't think democracy is just elections. That's one understanding. I would argue democracy is much broader. It's about associationalism. It's about having that space for citizens to debate, dialogue, and think about the decision-making that affects their lives.
Dmitri, I think when you made the comment about education and democracy, you got British history totally wrong. It was democracy which forced the government to provide education for the citizens. It was not education which made democracy possible. And equally, when we talk about Egypt or Gaza, what right do you have to say that the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and the Hamas in Gaza are illegitimate governments? Yeah. Why on earth can't these people elect who they want to elect?
Well, I didn't say that these governments are illegitimate. I just think they are bad. It's Middle Ages coming back to us in the 21st century. If Saudi Arabia has Sharia law and now all the West is supporting Saudi Arabia's actions against the secular government of Syria, if in Libya, where we had another so-called revolution, the new rulers are talking about introducing a Sharia law, I just want to rub my eyes. The West is supporting a return to the Middle Ages, provided that these Middle Ages is introduced by a popular vote.
I think, Dmitri, you undermine your own argument a little bit there, because you claim that democracy promotion is about promoting Western values. Now, you're absolutely right that if the Muslim Brotherhood win in Egypt, or if the Hamas are elected in Gaza, that doesn't reflect Western values. It doesn't reflect the everyday values of a liberal society like Britain. But it does reflect the will of the people who are living there, and that is the first step, as far as the West is concerned, to those people having a full and proper say in their destinies. So this is not about promoting our vision of the good life or saying you must behave like this and you must tolerate that. This is about saying actually people the world over, irrespective of their different beliefs and cultures, etc., should have a right to have a say in how they're governed.
Well, I absolutely agree that people should have a right to have a say.
Only if they can read and write, though.
But unfortunately, the problem is that we have lots of examples, like Germany in 1933, or like Russia in 1917, 1919, when you had, full democracy suddenly falling on the heads of the people who were not yet, educated enough to tell the populists and the dangerous nationalists from democratic and indeed humanistic governments. So, if the Western democratic model had been applicable to all the countries of the world, I would not be doing journalism, and I'm sure you would not be doing journalism, because actually you just copy the example of the United States or Britain and everything works fine. But unfortunately, the story is much more complicated. And the problem is that I don't believe in nation building if that nation building does not take into account, such things as literature. Just read the books that Egyptian writers write. And you see that it's a completely different society. And, the fact that I don't like what happened after Mubarak's fall in Egypt doesn't mean that I don't respect the Egyptian people. The fact that I didn't like the choice that Russian society made during the civil war in Russia doesn't mean that I don't like my fellow Russians. I think it was a tragedy that, before they could make a competent decision, Bolsheviks just offered this terrible populist option to them.
Dr. Armine, I'm going to let you get in there, but the point that Dmitri is raising is that there is a danger in forcing democracy on people ahead of time.
Yes, my question to Dmitri is, do you believe, just to understand that I've understood you, is democracy a Western value? Is that what you're saying? Because if that's what you're saying, I'd like to ask you another question about the universality of human rights. Do you believe human rights are universal? For instance, freedom of speech, freedom from torture, all of these things. Do you believe in that? If so, then what position are you taking in terms of arguing that we're pushing democracy, or the West is pushing democracy?
Well, I think that there are lots of forms of democracy and there are lots of forms of human rights. And the problem is that the West is very intolerant in introducing exactly the forms of democracy and the forms of human rights that it considers to be good. For example, when now Britain denies economic aid to the African countries which have not yet decriminalized homosexuality, I think it's a very cruel decision, because look how people live there. Without this aid, a lot of people can die there, including homosexuals. So I am for a patient attitude. We had this sentiment in the West. It was absolutely visible to us in Russia here that the idea was by the year 2000 to have Western forms of democracy rule all over the world. I think it's a very, very dangerous utopia, maybe even more dangerous than communism was.
Dr. Armine, are you happy with that answer?
I am, yes.
I'm not.
It's interesting to think about.
I think there's a big difference between saying democracy will vary from country to country. So if we take Germany, Britain and the United States, they are not remotely similar to each other. But the underlying principles of human rights, the right to free association, the right to free expression, the right not to be tortured, the right to a decent life, that is universal, and it takes a different form in many different countries.
I absolutely agree with you. And, you use this new term coined in the West, human rights. There are some very good old definitions for that. Dignity, ability to participate in taking decisions. I think basically democracy, if you want to know what it is, it's a chance for a person, a regular citizen, to have a say and to influence decisions of the government. There are lots of ways to do it, not necessarily the ones that we see, sort of deified in Western Europe, like presidential republic or parliamentary republic. There were lots of other things to do it. In Russia, for example, people like Tolstoy or Pushkin, they lived inside an authoritarian system, but they were absolutely free people, and their influence on society was probably greater than the influence of many NGOs today.
Can I just ask you, Dmitri, I'm sorry, you keep talking about how democracy can come in many forms, and I think everybody here would agree with you absolutely on that. But so long as people have a say, and I agree with you, and I think that democracies can change form and constitutions can change, and that's part of the process of democracies maturing. But do you not accept that part of that process happening, be it in Egypt, be it in Russia, be it here in the UK, in fact, is the role of civil society and the role of NGOs and the role of people outside of the state in advocating for change? You might not always agree, of course, with what it is that they want. Here in this country, we had a referendum on changing our voting system. I didn't agree with the people who wanted to change it, but you don't have to lock them up. because the discussion, the conversation within that space, within civil society, around how society should look and around how the state should look, that can happen, can't it? There's no great problem with it happening.
Well, I absolutely agree with you that people should be able to express themselves. And in Russia, we have lots of problems. To be frank with you, we don't have a full freedom of political action. But right now, we have a full freedom of political expression. I can say whatever I want, not only now, but also in Russian media where I write often. There are some difficulties with forming your own party or running as a candidate for presidency. I agree. But, this is a gradual process, so I'm still optimistic about Russia.
Is it not one that's aided by civil society and by NGOs? I mean, that's the question we're discussing here. Not about politicians themselves or forming a political party, but is it not better that the space is more diverse in terms of who's allowed to speak and who's allowed to say what they believe?
Well, I can give you an example. Okay, I won't name any names here, but there's one person who wanted to run as a candidate for presidency now, but who doesn't run. He has been a leader of a liberal party for 18 years, just like Brezhnev was the leader of the Soviet Union for the same period of time. And I think if it hadn't been for Western funding and for Western NGOs that supported him, he would have been replaced by younger people 10 years ago, and probably that party would win election. But because he was well received in the West, and because he had this charismatic image of a Russian liberal, he stayed there in the way of younger liberals. And we have the situation when actually there is no real liberal alternative on the political field in Russia, unfortunately. About Egypt, I agree with you that people should have a say. But, when people attacked the Israeli embassy in Cairo and ransacked it, something that was unthinkable under Mubarak, bad as he was. I suddenly had this idea. These people who attacked that embassy, they tell us that they did it on their own decision. They were not forced to do it by police, by government. You could see they were doing it on their own. They were slaves of their own misconceptions. They were slaves of their own hatred. I believe in the Christian concept of freedom, which is that freedom is also freedom from your sins. If you hate Israel so much that you blame all the problems of Egypt on Israel, you're not really a free person, even if you can vote for whatever party you want, and if you have a freedom, so to speak, freedom to attack an Israeli embassy.
I think Dmitri has got a far too narrow view of what freedom of expression means. I think it has to be linked to freedom of association, which means freedom of organisation to come for civil society produce from the grassroots organisations which enable the poorer, the weaker people to have the right to expression.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl, and we're having a debate on NGOs and democracy promotion. I'm joined by the City University professor Peter Willets, Dr. Armine Ishkanian from the London School of Economics, Max Wind-Cowie from the think tank Demos, and on the line from Moscow by Dmitri Babbitch, our in-house political analyst. Okay, we're running out of time here, so I'm just going to get Dr. Armine and then Dmitri to make one final comment.
I would absolutely agree with Peter. I think the freedom of expression is an issue, and that's why we've seen the use of social media such as YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter becoming so important, where mainstream television channels perhaps don't give air to controversial views or issues such as violence or hazing in the army, among other things, or corruption. So I think there are these issues that have to be taken into account, because if democracy is going to work, it's not simply about talking about voting, it's about also giving space for expression of viewpoints and criticism of power holders when there's abuse of power.
Dmitri?
I just wanted to make one final comment. All of our ideas would not work unless we improve the humans themselves. We should not forget that the real fight between good and evil is within an individual person's soul. If you don't improve humans, if we don't treat, if we don't go to see it, if we don't go
Democracy
to church,
does improve
no
humans,
organizations
Dmitri.
will save us.
It does a very good job of it.
That was Dmitri Babbitch, the political analyst, Discussing Russian non-governmental organisations, I was also joined by Peter Willets, a professor from London City University, Dr. Armine Ishkanian from the London School of Economics, and Max Wind-Cowie from the think tank Demos. You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm James Reinl. Stay tuned. We'll be back shortly.